credit for prompting substantial improvements to the Competition Act. These improvements include, among other things, a significant revamp of our abuse of dominance provisions, including stronger penalties, the addition of rebuttable structural presumptions in merger review and stronger remedies for anti-competitive mergers, the possibility for formal market studies to be initiated by the Commissioner, and insulating the Commissioner of Competition from adverse cost awards at the Competition Tribunal. By my count, there are only a few outstanding elements of Bill C-352 that have not been taken forward already in other legislation. In the grand scheme of competition law modernization that has taken place, the remaining issues are not of pressing concern, but certainly some of them could further enhance the Competition Act. We would be happy to discuss those few elements. There are also some aspects of the bill that would, in my view, represent a step backwards, given prior reforms, such as the reintroduction of a cap on cartel fines. We would be happy, of course, to discuss these as well. During our time today, or perhaps in a future appearance before this committee, it might also be productive to discuss what I often refer to as the elephant in the room in Canada. That is, regulatory barriers to competition in this country. The Competition Act is a foundational tool to protect and promote greater competition in Canada, but it is not the only tool. To build on the incredible progress made in modernizing the Competition Act, all of us in the public sector, at all levels of government, need to examine what more can be done to address the regulations and policies that hold back competition in Canada, often unintentionally. We know that Canada's competitive intensity has decreased over the last 2 decades. It will take a whole-of-government approach to turn the tide, with the federal government working alongside municipal, provincial, and territorial governments. Increased competitiveness is key to tackling affordability challenges, improving consumer choice, and fostering stronger, more inclusive growth over the long term, and, importantly, addressing Canada's pressing need for more productivity. Competition policy in Canada is clearly having a moment. We need to seize that moment. There has never been a stronger consensus that Canada needs more competition. Now is the time for governments across Canada to work together to make competition a national economic priority. Permettez-moi de conclure en disant.
Allow me to conclude by saying that the Competition Bureau is determined to applying the law in a transparent manner based on principles and probative data. We have been steadfast in our efforts to implement new and improved tools that Parliament has granted us. We will remain faithful to that approach. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to appear before you today, and we'll be pleased to answer your questions.
Look forward to your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Boswell.
Thank you, Mr. Boswell. Mr. DiDomenico now from the Canadian Bar Association, you have the floor.
I want to express appreciation on behalf of the CBA section for the invitation to appear today. Our members have significant experience advising a wide range of clients on competition matters, and we appreciate the opportunity to be heard, so thank you for that. By way of overview, many of the issues addressed in Bill C-352 have either been addressed in Bill C-56, which received royal assent in December of 2023, or are contained in Bill C-59, which is currently before the Senate. I would like to speak today regarding 2 proposals in Bill C-352, namely the merger prohibition and structural presumption provisions as Sections 8 and 9 of the bill, and the inclusion of efficiencies as a factor when assessing competitive effects for mergers and civil competitor collaborations at Sections 7 and 10 of the bill. Beginning with the merger prohibition provision, Bill C-52 would create an arbitrary bright line precluding Canada's Competition Bureau and the Competition Tribunal from evaluating the competitive effects of mergers with a combined market share of at or above 60%. The proposal would not take into account or differentiate between any level of increased concentration, even if the acquired target, for example, had a share of 1%. This would be an unprecedented and would make Canada a global outlier. Competition and antitrust laws globally recognize that market share and concentration alone are not themselves determinative of market power and competitive effects. As the Competition Act already recognizes, a conclusion regarding the competitive impact of a merger must evaluate important factors such as the likelihood of entry and expansion, the role played in the market by the acquired entity, the presence of other vigorous and effective competition in a market, and the nature of change and innovation in a market, among other things. In our submission, it would be inappropriate to fetter the ability of the Competition Bureau and the Competition Tribunal to conduct an analysis of market power and competitive effects based on the facts and evidence before them. Bill C-52's emphasis on market share and concentration to the exclusion of other factors also presents three further significant problems. First, the approach would remove entirely the analysis of what matters most, which is competitive conditions pre- and post-merger, in favor of a focus on just market share statistics that are not determinative themselves of market effects. Second, in many cases, a factual conclusion regarding market share cannot be reliably drawn based on a company's current market share. And third, merging parties frequently do not have the requisite data to determine what their market share is in any relevant antitrust market. Now, the Competition Bureau collects such information as part of its review, but unless the Bureau plans to share this information with merging parties or their counsel as part of the enforcement process, which they don't currently do unless required to in litigation, there are significant due process concerns that arise for merging parties. Turning to structural presumption provisions, the CBA section does not support the inclusion of structural presumptions in the Competition Act. We agree that concentration and market share levels can provide a useful preliminary screening mechanism to identify potentially problematic mergers. However, we disagree that a merger should be presumed to cause anti-competitive effects on the basis of market share alone. Further, including structural presumptions in the Competition Act, a statute, will not harmonize Canadian law with U.S. law. And this is important. In the U.S., structural presumptions were introduced in non-statutory enforcement guidelines, which are flexible in nature and are preferable to a fixed statute. So it's not part of any U.S. legislation. So if structural presumptions are introduced, we would submit that the appropriate place to introduce them would be in the Competition Bureau's merger enforcement guidelines, which is similar to the approach that continues to be taken in the U.S. Finally, and turning now to efficiencies, Bill C-52 proposes the inclusion of efficiencies as an explicit statutory factor in Sections 93 and 90.1 subsection 2 of the Competition Act when assessing whether a merger or a civil competitor collaboration would likely substantially lessen or prevent competition. The CBA section agrees with this inclusion. It's well recognized in Canada and globally that efficiencies are a relevant factor when assessing competitive effects because they can result in mergers or competitor collaborations in being pro-competitive, enhancing productivity and benefiting consumers. The Competition Bureau has advocated for efficiencies to be among the list of factors that the Competition Tribunal can consider when assessing competitive effects, and this change would also reinforce the Bureau's current approach when assessing the competitive impact of mergers and civil competitor collaborations in any event. Thank you for the opportunity.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, pour commencer la discussion,
Thank you very much. I'll start the discussion by giving the floor to Mr. Viss for 6 minutes.
All the witnesses for being here today. I think no matter what part of the country you come from, Canadians in the context of this legislation are wondering, why the heck do I have to pay so much for groceries? I looked in great detail during the first hour of our meeting today. Canada needs more grocery competition report from the Competition Bureau, and two key points were sort of addressed that I almost find right now are going to be hard to achieve and may even find themselves contradictory. The report outlines, in addition to some other studies conducted by the Competition Bureau, that when the largest firms in an industry, when they consolidate their position, their market share, they are less likely to be replaced or face significant challenges to their market share. The report also notes that we need to encourage growth in the entry of new competitors. In the context of grocery stores, though, what I essentially read this morning was that the Competition Bureau outlines that it's going to be hard to see competition in our grocery store sector in Canada. Would that be a fair assumption, Mr. Boswell?
Thanks for the question. My colleague, Mr. Durocher, will answer this.
What our report outlined was steps that governments can take to increase competition in the grocery sector. So give a few examples of addressing restrictive covenants and property controls, which can keep out new entrants across the country. Another is to draw attention to the benefit of a foreign entrant coming into the Canadian marketplace as informed by others. But so we continue to work with governments to prioritize and to get movement on these.
Right.
The other is we have since launched an investigation into the use of property controls by the largest grocers as well. So there are steps that can be taken to protect and promote competition in the industry, and this is a priority sector for the Bureau.
Agreed. More broadly, though, would you agree with my assumption that it will be difficult to achieve greater competition given the concentration of the large firms right now?
Competition takes time to manifest itself, and certainly the sector is concentrated right now. But if a new entrant were to come in markets across the country, that would have an impact. But I think that there's no question it's a concentrated market, but that's why we're working with governments to take meaningful steps to try and make it more competitive.
Would the Competition Bureau face the same types of challenges the federal government would face when seeking to encourage the municipal level of government to rezone property to allow for more grocery stores in our communities?
So in that regard, one of our key recommendations was for governments to limit and consider banning the use of property controls. That is within provincial and municipal remit. Yes. So it's not clear there's a role for the federal government. But if they violate competition laws by virtue of being anti-competitive in nature, then there is a role for them to be addressed through the Competition Act, which is federal legislation.
Thank you. It noted in this report that margins for our major grocery stores have increased 1% to 2%. I don't believe that's insignificant when you factor in the $1,000+ the average Canadian family is spending on a monthly basis at the grocery store. But would you agree that prices have also increased because of supply chain issues, carbon taxes, labor costs, and real estate as well?
So you're absolutely right. Our report stated that margins increased by 1% to 2%, which is modest but meaningful in the sense that it impacts and underscored the fact that we need more competition in the sector. We did not do a deep dive exploring all the ways that prices have gone up. There are a number of factors that came into place in the inflationary environment. There have been supply disruptions, but we did not do a deep dive on all the issues. We concentrated on examining competition because that's where our expertise lies.
Thank you. Has the Competition Bureau looked at food production in Canada as a key variable in the cost of food and the competition for products? I come from the part of Canada where we have the highest farm gate sales in the country, and that's largely due to the supply managed industries, but we're also the key producer of raspberries, blueberries, strawberries, and amongst other products that Canadians use. What impact does our current capacity to grow food have on what Canadians are paying at the grocery store?
So In our work, particularly in merger control, there are a number of cases where the Bureau has acted to protect competition, be it for to make sure that farmers are protected in terms of either the price they pay for fertilizer or their ability to sell grain. So there are a number of examples in that regard to make sure that the food supply chain is as competitive as it can be. Within the context of our market study, we did not do a granular.
Well, let's just touch base on that for a second, though. Supply chain. I also have the CN and CP rail lines go directly through my riding in the Fraser Canyon. Have we invested enough in critical infrastructure to allow for cheaper costs of goods through the flow of goods in Canada? Do we do a good enough job of allowing farmers to get their products to market in Canada?
So that is an area, if we look at rail competition, for example, we know that is critical for farmers and food producers to get their goods to market. And that is an area where it is a regulated space, and we've made recommendations in 2015 in the context of the Canada Transportation Act review for how to ensure that the rail system is as competitive as it can be.
Is it competitive enough?
You know, I think our mantra at the Competition Bureau is Canada needs more competition. I think we can point to a number of sectors where we need more competition in this country. And
so that would be a no?
Well, I can't opine on any specific.
Okay. One other point then with my limited time. The cost of labeling. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter, and the cost of formula at Costco was through the roof. It's a real expense for young mothers. And the number one thing, what we're being told at Costco, is that it's due to labeling issues. We face the same thing with children's Tylenol. What can we do to make labeling cheaper? How can we reduce red tape so mothers can get the formula they need quickly?
We're constantly advocating for ways to lessen barriers to entry and expansion.
What key recommendation can you provide?
Monsieur Vice, c'est tout le temps que vous aviez, malheureusement.
Mr. Vice, that's all the time you have. Thank you, Mr. Durocher.
Thank you, Chair. First, we have to recognize that Canada, by population, we are small at 40 million. Geographically, we are big, very big. Our south neighbor is a big population, big economy, etc. So we are in some sort of a special situation when it comes to allowing or not allowing companies to scale up and serve Canadians across this vast country. Professor LaRouche, I'm glad to hear your comments on the large and complexity that is there. Complexity, the only people who get benefited from the complexity are the lawyers. And it just adds to the cost of administering the competition laws to the public sector and in dealing with these big companies. You also mentioned about the institutional framework. So are you suggesting that, we have got so many bills regarding this particular issue. Are you suggesting that maybe we should have a totally new bill starting from scratch? Not that it is possible, but I'm just saying.
Well, if you ask me as an academic, yes, I would redraft the bill from scratch and make it way simpler. I mean, if you look at, and I think the commissioner explained it very well, all the modifications that are on the table do some good, but they also make the law more complex and heavier. And, the context is the same everywhere. When the stakes in this litigation get in the 100 million or in the billion range in Europe, I've been in practice. It's very great. You have an open bar. You can bill as much as you want because everything will be challenged, and every little piece of text will be taken apart. And I've seen it done everywhere. So to some extent, it's, I think the better approach for me is to keep the law general, let the authority do the job, and hammer the authority on the work it did. Make sure and spend time controlling that work.
I know, I agree with that approach, keeping the law, the legislation passed through Parliament as nimble as possible, delegating the authority for the regulation, and that can be flexible depending on the market needs or the changing circumstances. But, we are politicians. As political parties, we have to show to the people that we are working hard for you. Anyway, that is a different thing for a different time. And on the market share, again, I agree with you, keeping absolute number 30%, 50%, 60%, without recognizing was the vertical merger or a lateral merger or the nature of the industry, nature of the sector, etc. So I agree. Is there anything that on the market share that other countries are doing best that we can adopt?
So what we see, well, first of all, I think earlier Mr. Singh mentioned 60% as a European figure. I don't think so. I think in Europe, the threshold for a firm to be found dominant is around 50%, in the US around 60%, but this is a different question than merger control. Now, what is now in C59, and again, we can argue whether it should be in C59 or in guidelines, but the HHI approach is in line with what is done in the US and in line with what is done in Europe. The figures, the thresholds are not quite the same, but it's typically a good way to get into a case.
Okay.
and spot the cases that deserve some closer attention and from those that you can just let go and focus your resources
Thank you.
elsewhere.
I know you have got ideas. If there are more ideas, you can give it in writing to the committee so that we can consider them when we prepare our report. Mr. Boswell, you did mention the regulations and the policies with different levels of the governments. I think if we work together as with one single approach, with some objective, it can benefit. Is there any example you'd like to give on that?
Oh, there are many examples. Let me just back up just to say that Canada has been dropping like a stone over the last several decades in terms of regulatory barriers to competition throughout our economy. The OECD does a report on what they call product market regulatory indicators. And the last report that came out in 2018, Canada was second last in OECD countries for regulatory barriers that hinder competition. They are everywhere. They are at all levels of government.
That you and I agree that there are problems. My thing is that if you can show an example how and what we can do, that can change it for better.
Absolutely. Interprovincial trade. If we were to eliminate the barriers to interprovincial trade in this country, we would immediately see a significant increase in our GDP. And most notably, it would benefit the poorest provinces the most. There's a great example. Foreign restrictions on investment also hinder competition in the country. And they are in many different sectors. And you can go down, and which is why we talk about all levels of government attacking this problem. And it is urgent that we need to attack this if we want our productivity to get back on track and remain a G7 country. You go down to the municipal level. There are restrictions on where food trucks can park relative to restaurants.
You know, when it comes to interprovincial trade, you know, we have signed free trade agreements with over 51 countries covering most of the things, but we don't have the free trade within Canada. But you talk to any federal politician, everybody would say that we have to work on free interprovincial trade, but nobody builds the cat.
Merci, M. Arrière. That's all the time you had. Monsieur Garon, la parole est à vous pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Garon, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to salute all these people for being with us today. I'd like to get back to Professor Larouche's testimony. We're examining bills here. C56, C59, there's always additions. It always seems virtuous, of course, but these are always marginal additions. From my understanding of your testimony, there are two ways to consider reform to the Competition Act. The first would be to have a very well-defined framework that gives a great deal of room to maneuver. And the other would be to add conditions, which would give the impression that we're acting, but that in the final analysis would make the legislation so complicated that it's inoperable. Recently, I was discussing the case of the U.S. with structural presumption. And what I was told is that in the U.S., for instance, there's a presumption in favor of the consumer But in some cases, the competition authorities don't have to justify themselves as much as they do here in Canada. And that would add flexibility to the system. It would be faster, reduce appeals, because the interest of consumers are very diffuse, whereas those of corporations are very concentrated. They can afford a lot, so the consumer would be better protected. With that kind of regime, presumption in favor of the consumer be something that could be admitted into the Canadian competition system. Yes, it's something that could be admitted, but I want to be clear here. What you're talking about in these bills, and this one here before you, are reforms that are going in the right direction, but as you said, it's piecemeal. Let's take the example of the efficiency defense. It was put in there in 1980. This was something in the doctrine. We thought it was a good idea. It took 30, 40 years to get rid of it. In the meantime, everywhere else, this was something that was in the guidelines of the authorities. In the 90s, we added the idea that, yes, it's very nice to have better efficiency, but you have to prove that the consumers get something in the end. So how is this efficiency redistributed, in other words? Yes, in other jurisdictions, that was done with reinterpretation and authorities throughout the 90s. Here, we got stuck with a very rigid text and an interpretation that was very overwhelming in the Supreme Court. With all due respect to the Supreme Court, it was incomprehensible. They went into an even worse direction. Now it was abolished. I think we should allow the Competition Bureau to do whatever they want with those arguments. These are arguments that will come up all the time. They have to consider them. So is my interpretation correct? Because I'm no lawyer, but I have been around people in the economy and competition in the private sector. There are so many restraints and so many loopholes in the legislation that a business that can well afford to defend itself can always circumvent the law, whatever it is. So that's the first part of my question. And then there's that 60% rule. I asked Mr. Singh, where did he get that figure? He says, I looked at regimes across the world. We asked them which. He didn't know which. Now we realize there's not really a 60% rule. It's an arbitrary number. And we should be more consequential and say, what would be the effect of such and such a merger on consumer prices, for instance? How would efficiency be redistributed? So my impression is that we're adding constraints that could make the work of the regulator even more complex. Yes, I would tend to agree with you. The first question about the conduct of businesses, they do what they have to do. Given legislative texts, they will hire lawyers and consultants. More texts there are, the more arguments there are. When it's in the law, judges feel that they can interpret the law, and that gives us things like ter vita. But when it's Competition Bureau policies, judges tend to believe, well, we're going to be a little more discreet here and give the Bureau benefit of the doubt. So it's more favorable, I think, to have a balanced bill. On the 60%, the EU, the United States, when it comes to control of concentration, they start with HHI tests, indexes for concentration, as we will have with C59. Market shares don't play an enormous role because it's not a very good indicator. Because my understanding means that you can have two types of distribution of market share that give you the same index. So reducing that to market share prevents the Competition Bureau from doing its job because it reduces their tools to one tool only, that is this market share. Yes, the HHI takes into account not just the market share of the biggest, but the way all the other competitors are positioned in the market. Because if you have a concentration where you have one player who has 30%, but two others have 30% to counterbalance, it's not the same as you have one with 30%, and let's say you have another 200 that share the rest. So the HHI captures that. That's the tool that all authorities use. Thank you, Mr. Garon. Mr. Massé, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. I noticed a tone difference from my Conservative colleagues. It must be early morning caffeine injection that they had from the previous witness. But I'm glad to have us talking about this issue in here, and appreciate the fact that there has been some changes in the Competition Act over the years. Efficiencies one is, but I've been after for a long, long time. There's others. So we're here, and I think this context is important. And I'll ask this question across, maybe starting with Mr. Boswell across the board here. It is actually correct. This is a very difficult process to bring a private member's bill through. It is one of the tools that's available to ourselves as members of Parliament. And as well, too, we've seen recently the government did act on changing some legislation, not to the full extent. But here we are with some pros and cons to some of this bill here. But essentially what our options in front of us are right now is to either amend the bill in different aspects and carry on with the work where there's some good, strong consensus on items, or alternatively, quite frankly, with the time and the things that we're looking at, we're probably not going to see other types of changes in the Competition Act probably for another 2 to 3 years, quite frankly. I just don't see that happening. I mean, I can't predict the future, but given the fact that we have a Parliament that's winding down on the time frame right now, given the fact there would be another electoral call, given the fact that this committee would have to take this up again, and I'm pleased to hear the Competition Commissioner's comments about productivity and so forth and efficiencies related to regulatory issues, and that's probably a study we could even look at, but the chances of it getting to all those things is very, very reduced. So with all that in mind, I'll start with you, Commissioner. What do we do at this point? Do we look at amending the bill to give extra tools and strengthen for competition in Canada right now and work with what we got? Or do we wait the time frame that's going to be really, and hope that, you know, at a bare minimum we deal with this years later? Because that's really kind of where we're at now. We have the other private members bill that's in the Senate, which is great. We don't know what that's going to be, but these are the practical steps that are in front of us to choose, and those are the paths that we have available to us. And I do take the point again that it would be greater and a better process was there, but our democracy is one that you know, may fail us in many respects. I still don't know a better process because the alternatives that other places in this world have are not better. So, Mr. Boswell, if you could go across to the witnesses, and please take the time you have. I think about 4 minutes to go, and 2 minutes per person, if you like.
Well, thank you for that very pragmatic question, and I was hoping to have an opportunity to address that head on, which is from the Competition Bureau's perspective. As I said in my opening comments, you know, we're really pleased with the attention that's been paid to competition, that, you know, this private member's bill, other private members' bills, and government bills have done to amend the law. And I agree with Professor LaRouche. It was probably too complex out of the gates in 1986 when it was, you know, some say drafted by the business community. In terms of this bill, I would, from the Competition Bureau perspective, say we don't need to address clauses 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Clause 4, which deals with the penalty provision for federal financial institutions, is great in terms of the 14 years, but it should be a fine in the discretion of the court, not a max fine, $25 million that it has now. Clause 12, the Bureau believes, and we put this in our recommendations to ISED, that a 3-year limitation period for notifiable transactions is a good step forward. Right now it's only 1 year. Our colleagues in the United States, there's no limitation period on reviewing mergers. And finally, with respect to the costs award, that has been addressed in C-59, but I just point out that in our submission to ISED, we talked about full immunization. C-59 is a pretty reasonable balance, so one way or the other, pretty happy with how that comes out, but really quite strongly don't believe we need those. We need those other clauses. They've been addressed in C-19, C-56, and hopefully soon in C-59, but this has been a valuable contribution to the debate, the marketplace of ideas.
So in summary, just carry on our work, but looking at all the things that you've had there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but yeah.
you could
carry
go ahead with a few sections, and the rest has been addressed adequately in other bills.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I think many sections are kind of addressed already from those that were left and that were discussed earlier. I think the article, section 3 is a good idea, but I would venture it's going to run into trouble before the courts. And the merger threshold sections 8 and 9 are, to me, not a good idea for reasons I explained earlier.
Thank you.
So the only thing I would note is, as you noted, the efficiencies defense has already been abolished. So with respect, and that is actually the current law of the land. The key, though, there's a bit of a lacuna in that in abolishing the efficiencies defense, efficiencies were not added as a factor that the Commissioner and the Competition Tribunal can consider in the context of a proposed merger or a civil competitor collaboration. I would characterize that as an oversight because globally, antitrust laws do see efficiencies as a factor that can be considered when assessing competitive effects. So as a result of that, efficiency should be built into sections 93 and 90.1 subsection 2 of the Competition Act.
And Commissioner, do you have opinion on that?
Respectfully, I don't agree with my friend, Mr. Di Domenico, who is a friend.
Yes.
I believe that it's been made very clear with the repeal of the efficiencies defense in the merger provisions and in the competitor collaborations. We still have a section that says any other factor that's relevant to competition. Minister Champagne has said that any other factor could be efficiencies that are pro-consumer.
Okay.
So we can look at it. We will look at it. We're not turning a blind eye to it. We do not need to reintroduce this complicated offsetting and outweigh test that existed in the old version. It's going to complicate things and stick us in the old version where there's a notion that if you have these efficiencies, but they, and the merger harms consumers, it could still go ahead. I'd say leave it out entirely. We will consider it under the any other factor provision that's in the Act.
Okay, so we can follow up on this as well, too. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that things moved on as the bill was crafted and created, and that's normal in terms of processes. And same with my position on the tribunal, going through Bill C-27. I've kept myself open to creating a tribunal, but part of it, but from the evidence that's been presented, and we have never really on this table dealt with tribunals before, I've come to some conclusions that give me great concerns. So we left the door open for an amendment to the tribunal, not to get rid of it, but I mean, we could even get rid of the tribunal here if this actually body chose to do so. But at any rate, that's kind of where we're at. So we're in a work in progress environment here. So I hope we can actually kind of continue to add on while we have the opportunity.
Merci, Monsieur Massé. Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux, 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Boswell, you talked about a generational update. What do you mean at that when it comes to updating a bill? But before you answer that question, I'd like to ask you this. Earlier, Mr. Viss said the question that's killing us, if I could say so, is that a bill like this, will it really have an impact on the cost of groceries? That's the first question.
Merci pour.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. If Mr. Généreux agrees, I will answer in English, as it's quite technical.
So the combination of the bills that have come in front of this committee and the House Finance Committee and the Senate over the last several years will, I believe, have an impact in the long term on aspects of competition throughout our economy. It's not going to happen overnight. There's no doubt about that. And we're not, we don't want to be in the business of over-promising. But this country has been a country that has not paid attention to the importance of competition in the organization of its economic affairs for decades, literally decades. We're a country where we have multiple oligopolies, where we have, very significant competitive intensity problems. And this is one important piece to drive competition, which drives down prices, which increases consumer choice, drives innovation, drives productivity. Those are the important long-term benefits of having a country that places importance on competition. Can it, overnight fix the affordability crisis that we're experiencing? No, and we're not promising that. But these are important reforms that turn the ship around, a ship that's been sailing since at least 1986.
Alors, demain matin, un gouvernement fait un
So tomorrow morning, let's say a government made a choice and decided to cut the carbon tax. Because the people who produce the food we eat and we buy in the grocery stores are taxed at different levels, including the carbon tax now. The people who transport that food are also taxed. The people who process that food are taxed, including the carbon tax. So, of course, that carbon tax is passed on by supermarkets to the consumer. If a government was to remove the carbon tax tomorrow morning, would it have a direct effect on consumer prices?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, generally speaking, as a matter of economics, if you remove costs in the supply chain, you're going to end up being able to, generally speaking, offer products at a lower price.
Donc, la réponse est oui.
So the answer is yes. You also mention productivity, the word productivity. To my knowledge, in Canada, 1 hour worked is about $55 in revenue for Canada. 1 hour in the US is about $75, roughly, and in Europe about $80. What's our problem in Canada when it comes to productivity? What's the link between that productivity or lack of productivity and the bill before us?
Thank you for the question. I would say it goes beyond the bill before us today, C-352. It goes to the point that I was making, that competition drives productivity. There are innumerable studies that point to that very clearly. Competition drives productivity in an economy and is a key pillar of a capitalist economy for that very point. And as I say, we have not placed significant emphasis on competition in this country for decades. I mean, this was pointed out. There was a blue ribbon panel in 2008 the government put together to look at competition in the economy. And in that panel in 2008, they pointed out how competition has been neglected in Canada and how competition is a key driver of productivity. And we're at the point now where the senior deputy commissioner, senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada a month ago said it's time to break the glass. There's an emergency. There's urgency. We need to address these. And she, in a speech, pointed clearly to competition as vital to address this productivity problem in our country.
Merci. J'aimerais laisser mon collègue.
Thank you. I'd like to allow a few seconds for Mr. Williams to put a question.
A brief question.
Brief question. Thank you. And Commissioners, thank you for coming today. I know you're starting an airline industry study. The public submission deadline is June 17th. These are the new powers by C-56, so we're just testing those out. One concern we have is there's a letter written by the minister, the industry minister, who just said, his quote was, "We want you to focus on domestic airline services, not airports." Obviously, we think you should be looking at the whole thing. Airport competition is just as important as the domestic side. If that comes back, and does the minister, through 56, the powers we have, does it allow him to change the course of the study after we've reviewed it or after you've gotten the public consultation on the 17th, yes or no?
My understanding is that the changes to the law from C-56, we consult on the terms of reference, which we have out there now, as you rightly point out. And once we hear input from Canadians, and we're getting a lot of input, I can tell you that, we then may amend the terms of reference depending on points that people have made in our consultation. We then provide that to the minister for approval, the terms of reference of the study.
And can he change the study if he wishes?
Thank you, Mr. Williams, but that wasn't that short of a question you asked, et Monsieur Généreux m'a eu. Je pensais que c'était...
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Généreux got me. I thought it was time for him. Now, we started at 12:08, if you agree. in order to be fair to everyone, I'll give the floor to someone else for 5 minutes.
C'est le tour de M. Van Bynen. Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai appris beaucoup pendant cette conversation. Nous avons parlé des rapports du Bureau de la concurrence. Selon ce bureau, il faut moderniser les lois canadiennes sur la concurrence pour l'adapter à l'économie d'aujourd'hui. De nouveaux éléments ont été introduits. Les obstacles réglementaires sont un aspect important, surtout pour le commerce interprovincial. Y a-t-il d'autres éléments qui devraient être pris en considération? Des éléments pour améliorer l'intensité concurrentielle du Canada? Rappel au règlement, s'il vous plaît. Oh.
OK, il y a peut-être un petit enjeu technique. Est-ce que, if we try again, are you...
I'm sorry, it was me.
Now, properly.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Boswell.
Well, I do think that this whole of government approach that I spoke of earlier is something that we as a nation should undertake with leadership from the federal government. And when I talk about that, and when we talk about that at the Bureau, it's not like we've created this out of thin air. This is what other countries have done and are doing. In the 1990s, the Australians had a productivity commission where they examined 1,800 laws and regulations, and with a view to enhancing competition throughout the Australian economy. The federal level, the Australian states also participated, and it resulted in a significant increase in their GDP. 2.5% Australian GDP went up as a result of that work, about 5,000 Australian dollars per household, which is a significant amount of money in the 90s. So there's the Australian example. The United States currently has a whole of government approach to competition in the American economy. There's a White House Competition Council where all the secretaries of the various departments in the U.S. government are tasked with identifying competition problems within their area of remit and fixing them. So we're not talking about something that hasn't been done elsewhere in the world, but it's something that we desperately need to get to work on in Canada if we want to solve these problems we have.
Thank you. That's good for us to hear about other examples that are happening outside of Canada, and that might be a good starting point for us to go forward with. We talked about, or we've heard about how the reference to the price on carbon was an issue in terms of the cost of food. And I heard earlier there was a statement about we would measure the effectiveness of competition and the value and how the value of these efficiency arguments were translated to value for the consumer. How could we accomplish that? If we're looking at efficiencies, how do we ensure that those efficiencies are realized by the consumer? Perhaps, Mr. LaRouche, if you could address that.
Well, in terms of legislative or text or guidelines, typically you add language to the efficiency defense to say that the party invoking the efficiency defense must show that the efficiencies flow through to the consumers, at least in a reasonable part. And then the authority has the tools to ask the question, well, okay, you're going to save 10% on your cost with this merger. How much of this is going to be passed through to the consumers? That's the type of provision that you need.
Any examples of that could be used as a reference point?
Yes, it's standard in EU legislation, and I believe it's in the guidelines in the U.S. as well.
I wonder if you could forward that on to us so that can be part of the record here as well. The other item that I was looking at was in terms of the clauses that you felt weren't as effective, and you referenced clause number 3, 8, and 9. Do we have all the details on that, your reasons around the need to change clauses 3, 8, and 9? Professor LaRouche?
Yeah, 8 and 9, I would think that what is now is in C59 with the HHI index is good. That's more in line with worldwide standards than market share thresholds, for sure. And as far as 3 is concerned, to me, the underlying problem is this need to always choose between 45 and 90.1 as a vehicle. That will not be changed. Then it's a good idea to put some serious sanctions under 3 as well. But it will run into problems before courts because these are criminal provisions. But if you want to have a level of sanction that matches what is done elsewhere, it should be around 10% as a theoretical maximum, and typically the authority will go around 4 or 5% of turnover, so at the level where the profits should be. That's the practice. And that would mean in Canada, if you go on a factor of 1 to 10 with the EU or the US, we would be playing in the 100 million range.
Merci, Monsieur Van Bynen. C'est tout le temps que vous...
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Garon for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't expect to discuss this, but since Mr. Williams started, I'll put this question to Mr. Boswell. There are 3 major airports in the Montreal area, Saint-Hubert, Dorval, and Mirabel. There's one airport administration for 2 of them. The consequence is they just about closed one to public commercial flights. Seems to me that is designed by the federal government to be anti-competitive and to have anti-competitive behavior by airports of Montreal. Are these among the subjects that interest you now that you have more investigative powers?
I think that, thank you for the question, by the way, and apologize answering in English, but, we're going to be looking at a broad array of issues in this market study. We have the draft terms of reference out now and hope to have those finalized later in June or July. But right now in the draft, we talk about looking at airport governance as it impacts competition. And we'll see if that becomes part of the final terms of reference.
Et dans le secteur privé,
in the private sector, would it be tolerated if one company buys another and takes just about the entire market share and decides to shut it down to commercial activity? If we were any other field than aviation, would that kind of practice be tolerated?
alors qu'on a des problèmes.
Whereas we have capacity problems.
It's difficult to speculate on hypotheticals on the fly, so I will
Faites-vous plaisir.
refrain the temptation to give you an answer.
Merci beaucoup. Question.
Thank you very much. A very quick question for Mr. Larouche. We have less than a minute left. You talked about the regulatory constraints that are constraints on competition. You've worked in Europe. It's recognized for having a major regulatory regime. What could we do to try to make things more flexible? Where should we start? That's a major question. You have 20 seconds to answer. I'd say 12 seconds. Well, I think that Commissioner Boswell is totally correct when he talks about the horizontal approach. There's a great deal of work to be done. The investigative procedure that will be put into place for the first time with aviation services in Canada should allow the Commissioner and the Competition Bureau to give specific recommendations about amendments. That is the horizontal approach. We could put our finger on problems that exist elsewhere. And beyond all that, there's a change in mentality. I've been back in the country for 7 years. It's pretty quiet in Canada. Markets are lazy, I'd say. And when you look at supermarkets, for instance, we talked about that today, margins are very high. If you say 5%, it's not much, but in reality, it's about 2% in the US, 1% in Europe. So 5% is very high. And the major players have identical policies. Everyone has very similar supermarkets. People complain prices are too high. They open they may broaden their range, Max C, Super C, whatever. But in Europe, you have a greater range of business models. There are new entrants in the markets. You can be up there with the high market, or then you can have a lower middle price supermarket. Every supermarket has its own business model. We have to have a situation where businesses are afraid of what others will do rather than what we see today, where they anticipate what others will do very easily. Very interesting. Mr. Massey?
If you can use less than the full 2 minutes and a half.
I will, Mr. Chair, so I'll let our guests go as well. But I do want to make sure I get on the record about the 60%